everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Christian Contrarian. I'm Gary Wayne, author of the Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and this is episode 28, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, part 2, The Winds of Babylon. In part 1, we discussed the four horses of the apocalypse riding out just before the end, or just before the start of the last 7 years. Not after the start, but just before. And we talked about Revelation 2 verses 9 and 10 about the 10 days of tribulation for the poverty-stricken church of Smyrna, and that this tribulation could be an extension part of the last two tribulations. And we covered off the two tribulations in earlier series, with the first tribulation in the first 3.5 years of the saints, and then the second tribulation of the whole world in the last 3.5 years. But Revelation 2 talked about an additional 3 years of tribulation, and during the time of Babylon's rise and the preparation for the 10-king empire that Babylon would sponsor. And so we should expect tribulation and disasters and calamities and wars and rumors of wars and all of the birth pangs continuing to come forth as the seals are being opened and increasing in intensity. And all of this is part of the tribulation that is happening as the four riders are coming out. And so we talked about Zechariah 6 and how the four horsemen line up with Zechariah 6 and the four chariots in terms of their descriptions and what they do, and that these were the four spirits of heaven, the four winds of heaven, just as the riders we talked about translating out of Greek as the pronoun he, himself, and them, all going back to a self-reflecting pronoun of autos that means a baffling wind. And these are the winds and the spirits of Zechariah 6, just as a spirit can also be translated as wind. So these are angelic beings that come from before the throne in Zechariah and in Revelation. And these are the angels of prophecy sent forth throughout the earth, throughout the ages. And they bring about the beast empires. They bring about the metallic empires that we also talked about in part 1. And so they stir up the winds in Daniel 7 and 8 to bring out these four empires that end in Rome and are the basis for the beast empire that rises out of the sea in Revelation 13 and 17 in the end time, that are going to be stirred up again by these four winds and them being released. And we also talked about the four angels that seem to be released at the same time or just after, starting in Revelation 9, and somehow connected to these four winds of prophecy. And so all of that we talked about in the rise of Babylon, which will bring about the end time empire of the 10 kings and the start of the last 7 years in Revelation 7. So having covered all of that, we're going to move on in the relationship of the four horsemen into other end time prophetic events. And in this case, more about Babylon. And Babylon is so important. Just as Babylon is rising and coming to power at the opening of these seals, so that it can bring about the end time empire that we talked about, that has perhaps that bow and crown, which is a laurel wreath with a white robe, that we should expect a different kind of leader, and Antichrist will be of a similar ilk coming out of that leadership as he rises to power with the start of the last 7 years. But we're going to go back now to Zechariah 2, which is 4 chapters before Zechariah 6, because there's so much more information leading up to the release of the four winds, the four chariots, the four horsemen of the end time. And so in Zechariah 2, we're told about the four winds again coming in as an allegory, but the winds are connected to Israel and Judah in terms of the curses of the covenant for not fulfilling the obligations of the covenant. And of course, with Judah absolutely denying and then having their Messiah, our Messiah, crucified. And so first Israel is dispersed around the world and lost, and it has become invisible. And then after the crucifixion of Jesus, Judah is dispersed around the world as well. And so now God says he is about to deliver Israel and bring them back into the covenant. And that's Zechariah 2, 6, and 7. And he's going to deliver them from Babylon. So Babylon is going to be rising, and he's going to be delivering them from Babylon and protecting them from Antichrist in the last 3.5 years. And this is going to match up with Revelation, just as all of Zechariah does, and all the Old Testament prophecies tend to do, because everything has to fit like a glove. So this kind of lines up in Revelation 18 and what we're going to get to in this session, where God gives an edict just before the destruction of Babylon at the midpoint of the last 7 years for all of his people to come out of Babylon. So by this point, you have all of Israel awakened, called by name, and being persecuted and imprisoned throughout this whole process of just before the start of the last 7 years and the first 3.5 years. And then you have the tribulation of the saints, and you have rapture that's going to be going on. I'm going to come back to that in a second. And then you're going to have all the people, whether or not it's Israel and Judah, told to come out of Babylon before things really start to set a course where there is going to be no safety from. Let's put it that way. And so in Revelation 6, Babylon rises to power as the seals open. And then after the seals open, then you start to see Antichrist rising to power, prominence, and then to full Antichrist by the midpoint of the last 7 years. And this all happens when the 4 horsemen come out. And in Zechariah 2:1, still, it talks about many nations are going to be joined in God in that day, when the people are going to come out of Babylon, and he's going to send back Jesus in the end time. So again, this is matching up very, very well with Jesus' chronology that he provides in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and 21. And Jesus is going to be sent back for rapture. He's going to be sent back for Exodus, and he's going to be sent back for Armageddon. And they're at different points in the last 3.5 years. And that's why Luke 17:22, and one more time in Luke 17, it's going to talk about, or Jesus is going to talk about the sons of the days of the Son of Man. So multiple days that he's going to come back. That's because he's got to complete the bride. And we're going to be talking about that in the next part to this series. And so these are the days of the Son of Man. And all of it starts with the opening of the seals that leads into the introduction of the trumpets and then the introduction of the wrath bowl. So you have that linear progression. So it's important to get the chronology correct. Just as we need to understand the reign of Babylon is going to be sort of entrenched by the start of the last 7 years and the signing of the covenant, the negotiating of the covenant by Antichrist in Daniel 9:27. And so Babylon will come to power just before that, as it rises probably in these 3 years of false prophets and in calamities of the birth pangs as they're getting stronger. And all of this is in place to sponsor the covenant for the 10 king beast empire of the last days. So in Zechariah 5, moving forward, and I know we could cover off Zechariah 4 and the two witnesses, which all are coming about with the start of the last 7 years, but I'm going to move forward here on Zechariah 5 because this happens just before, sort of from a linear chronological aspect of what's being done in Zechariah, before Zechariah 6, where the four chariots and the four winds of prophecy come out. And so there's a timing here that I think is very, very important as it starts to mesh with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And in Zechariah 5:8 it says, wicked is cast into an ephah. And an ephah is a type of measurement and or an economic system. And this is an ephah that is wickedness. And it goes forth throughout the entire earth. So this system, this ephah, the system of measurement, this economic system of evil, as it's talked about in 5:3 of Zechariah, of those who steal and swear oaths. Steal and swear oaths. So they're going to steal from the multitudes of the people on the earth, the elite will, and the elite of the religious class as well. They're going to swear oaths, not only within the secret societies of the elite, whether or not it's Freemasons or Illuminati or Rosicrucians or the upper bloodline orders of the bloodlines of the kings that are going to make up this end time empire, who swear oaths to their religion and to their gods. This is going to be the system even before Antichrist introduced the mark of the beast system at the midpoint. But it's all sort of part of it, as everything is ramping up to that kind of apex where Antichrist is crowned and takes power. So this is a system, an economic system, even though Babylon is also a religion. It's going to control the world's economic system. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. And in verse 5:11 of Zechariah, it says Shinar has a house built for it. And what's really important about that to understand is that Shinar is where Babel was built by Nimrod, the first sort of archetypical post-Diluvian Antichrist, and the mystical religion of Enochian mysticism that crosses the flood reappears, and you have a rebellion with an Antichrist figure ruling over all of the people, taking place within 100 years after the flood. And this is the house that is built in Shinar, so a new Babylon. This is Revelation 17 Babylon. This is the Babylon religion of the end time, and the one who's going to impose this economic system throughout the earth. And in Micah 6, we get a little bit more information on that, and that's verses 10 and 11 in Micah, where it says, this wickedness is the measures. And measures goes back to the word ephah. So this is the same system. And with their balances of wickedness, they put people into bondage. And this is an economic system of slavery that Micah 6 is talking about that matches up perfectly with Zechariah 5. And the imagery and the allegory and the timing is all the same. So one shouldn't be all that surprised that this is the timing of Revelation 6:5 and the black horse. Because the black horse introduces famine, and that you're going to pay a penny for certain measures or an ephah of a day's worth of work. So people in the economic system are going to be forced down. They're going to create a new socialism, the old feudal system. So it's not really new. So the oil and the wine are going to be protected for the elite, and the elite are going to have everything that they want, but the average person, the human, is going to have to work for a day's worth of food. as everything has come apart with the calamities. And this is the new economic system of the ephah that is placed between heaven and earth, as Zechariah talks about. And we understand that it's a day worth of wages from Matthew 20 verse 2, where a penny is defined as a laborer's wage for a day's pay. And so again, we need to look to find the allegories within the Bible. And this is the time of the four horsemen. So all of the four horsemen of Revelation 6 match up very well with much of the prophecies in Zechariah 5, including the scroll. So in the opening of the seals is the opening by Jesus of the scroll that leads later to, at the end of the seventh seal, into the trumpets, just as the seventh trumpet then leads into the wrath bowls. So you can use that as part of a chronology, particularly as you line it up with what Jesus says and what Old Testament prophecies say, and in fact all prophecies. But if you just sort of slide everything into Jesus' chronology that he provides to you in the Gospels, things start to make sense and they don't get too confusing. And so in Zechariah 5, again, this is the introduction of the flying scroll, where Babylon, Shinar, is established as a base for this economic system in the rise of Babylon before the start of the last 7 years. So everything is going to line up. And in Revelation 18, we get an understanding in the destruction of Babylon how powerful of an economic system this religion will be, who controls the 10 kings in the first 3.5 years, so much so that they grow to hate the woman riding the beast of empires and the 10 king empire and controlling them because of the wealth. I mean, Babylon is described as becoming fabulously wealthy, but on the backs of the poor. So everybody's going to be provided these strict rules of ascetic poverty and dietary rules and things like that. It's going to be like the monastic orders on steroids, the Essenes on steroids, Opus Dei on steroids, in terms of how they're going to force people to live. And you're going to have to work for a day's worth of wages because of all the wars and disasters that will be taking place. And this is Babylon, where the ephah is set up between heaven and earth, as we talked about in verse 9. And the flying scroll is the curse that goes throughout the whole earth, just as the four winds do in Zechariah 6, just as the four horsemen do in Revelation 6. And these are the ones in 5:2 those who swear oaths and steal from the people. So again, we're getting a confirmation again of the organizational structure and the belief system of secret societies and mystical religions that are in power with Babylon, just as Babel was a polytheist religion. And this is the scroll that has all of the curses that go throughout the earth, which matches up with the allegory of the scroll that Jesus is opening in Revelation 6. And the reason why that is so important to understand is because they lead to 25% of the destruction of the people in the earth in the scroll, throughout the whole earth, with the seal judgments, which then leads to 33% as the tensity, the birth pang effect of what's coming, the end time and the coming of Jesus. The trumpets take us to 33%, and then the wrath bowls come out of the last trumpet, and that would destroy everybody on earth and all of the earth, except that Jesus steps in to shorten those days. Otherwise, all would be slaughtered. And all of this is taking place up to the point of the wrath bowls under the power of Babylon. And Babylon is described as this opulent woman, just as a woman in the Old Testament in various allegories, whether it's prostitution or adultery, is the worshiping of a polytheist religion. the religion not of the God of the Bible, and that all of the people marry themselves to him, and that's where the oath comes in. And that this is going to be like a mother goddess introduction, just as you have in the old pantheon, you have a male god and you have a mother goddess. So expect something like an Isis or a Sophia to be a significant part, and to be part of the Revelation 12 manipulation of the woman in heaven and the Mary apparitions that we're starting to see. Watch for all of that to come together, and dig into the Medjugorje apparitions and the 6 children in the 90s that were initiated with a timetable to come out with 10 apocalyptic prophecies of doom that will come out one at a time, to convince and scare people to convert to this religion. This is the religion that takes over Christianity, first through the Roman Church, and then through Protestantism, and then the rest of the world, because these prophecies of doom will be so large that all people will recognize this as the true religion. And nobody wants to be destroyed from the face of the earth. This is the new Babel. And that's why the allegory is so important to understand, and that we define that within the allegory. And the first Babel is Nimrod and that mystical religion after the flood. And it's a typical end time scenario with your Antichrist figure and your polytheist religion with complete sway over people. So let's now move into Zephaniah. And we're going to talk about Babylon not only as a religion, and not only as this economic power, but as a city. And it says in Zephaniah 2:15 that this is the rejoicing city of Babylon, and declares that there is none besides me. And this is the Queen of Kingdoms. This is why she's described as the woman who rides the beast. This is the Queen of Heaven. And you're going to see these titles start to come out by those who are manipulating Scripture and those who are of the polytheist belief system, to deceive people into a false chronology of the end time, a shortened period, so that they accept Antichrist before Jesus comes. And that's why there has to be a counterfeit Armageddon, which I think is the Gog War, Joel 1 and 2, and the Revelation 9 War. And again, you'll see how that really matches up from a chronological perspective if you just take that step back and let prophecy be guided by what Jesus said. So, but back to the city that there is none like her, that all the merchants of the world will grow rich through. The one that Babylon grows rich through, because she'll probably issue a value-added tax on every transaction. So every electronic transaction will have a portion that goes to this new religion. And we know it is a city, because when Babylon is destroyed in Revelation 17:18, it's called a city. Just as it's the rejoicing city in Zephaniah. And just as Jeremiah 51 describes it as another destruction, we're going to come back to that in a second, of Babylon as Babylon city. But it's not just the one time it's called a city. And for people who don't think it has a city as part of its meaning, we can't ignore inconvenient passages. And it's one thing to have one time or two times, as we talked about in Zephaniah and in Revelation 17:18, but in Revelation 18 there's another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, so a total of 6 times in Revelation alone between Revelation 17 and 18 it's called a city. So it's called the city in Revelation 17:18, 18:10, 18:16, 18:18, 18:19, and 18:21. It's a city. And this is where the world is going to be centered from. It's going to be the capital city, the economic city, the political city, and the religious city, just as Babylon was a Pesher code for Rome in the time of Jesus, used by the Essenes, and also used in Peter do talk about, on only once in the book of Peter, where they're writing letters and they're in the city of Babylon, which is a Pesher code for Rome. And when you take Babylon in the New Testament back to its original Greek meaning, not only does it mean Babylon city of old, Babylon the empire, but also it has in there, it's an allegory for Rome. So we should look at perhaps Rome as being the city that Babylon is going to be situated at, where you already have a universal religion, you already have these Mary apparitions going on, and it's part of that revived Roman Empire of the end time. Things tend to be pointing in that direction. And in Isaiah 13, we have a description of the destruction of Babylon as being akin to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's going to be totally destroyed by nuclear weapons, and it's going to be a habitation for beasts and devils and satyrs, just as Isaiah 34 has a similar type of prophecy for the destruction of the entire world at Armageddon, and the same types of beasts. These are part of the angelic aspect of the conspiracy to destroy the earth and to destroy humankind. And so this is the economic system, the religion, and the city that is destroyed in Revelation 17, so that when Antichrist runs the power. And it says in Revelation 17 that the 10 kings will give their power over to Antichrist because they hate the woman of the beast that much. And then she is utterly destroyed. And then Antichrist will replace the religion of Babylon with a newer religion. He will be worshipped as God, just as Satan will be worshipped as God. This happens at the abomination in the temple at the midpoint of the last 7 years. And the mark of the beast system is then implemented. So this economic system that has been coming will come to complete fruition. So again, as this economic system comes about, we need to be taking a step back to understand that it may have a lot of looks like the mark of the beast, but it won't be complete until Antichrist comes to power. So in Jeremiah 51, we have a destroying wind that is raised against Babylon. And this destroying wind seems to be very much related to the four winds of the four horsemen. So they're still affecting the progress of prophecy that has to be fulfilled throughout the last 7 years, which is why they're part of the scroll. So it's also why a lot of people like to collapse everything onto as being the same disasters, but you have to have the linear manner. But understand that these four horsemen that go about through the earth, that are bringing about prophecy, the catastrophic events, and permitting all of those things to happen, this will continue, they'll continue to be writing about. And the restrainer will be pulled back. And so we'll have Antichrist who comes to power at the midpoint, and he destroys Babylon at that point. So again, chronology is lining up very, very nicely. And this is the time when Zechariah 2 is telling everybody to leave Babylon, and Revelation 18 is telling everybody to come out of Babylon, because it's going to be totally destroyed. And not only physically, but spiritually. So it's almost like a point where people can still earn eternity if before they take the mark of the beast. So it's kind of literally that threshold. And so Revelation 13:1, we have the four winds who stirred up these 10 kings that leads to Antichrist at the midpoint. And Daniel 7 talks about those four beasts of the empire that are stirred up by the four horsemen and the four chariots, the four winds. And the end time empire will have looks of all of that, and it will have the same mystical religion that dominated all the empires past, whether or not it's Assyria, Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, or Rome. It's the same religion, because it is the same root religion of rebellion that took place in the antediluvian epoch with the original Nephilim. because nothing is new under the sun. So all things are going to happen again. And so with the destruction of Babylon, then everything is sealed going forward for the last 3.5 years. That's the introduction of the mark of the beast. Antichrist is crowned to power. The restrainer has been removed. Judea has fled to the wilderness. Israel has already been awakened. They are in prison. Then rapture comes, and Judah and Israel will wait for Jesus to come for Exodus, which will come in the time of the year of the Lord's favor, and before the year of the day of the Lord. So one would expect within the last 2 years of the last 7 years, you're going to have that Exodus, and then Jesus comes back again for Armageddon. And so if we just look at how this sort of plays out in terms of the four horsemen and the winds, these are the same winds that brings Babylon to power and permits Antichrist and the wrath bowls to be released. And it's the rise of Babylon that is totally connected to the crown and the bow and the false prophets and all of the birth pangs that Jesus is talking about in the first part of his oration in Matthew 24 before the abomination, where you have the birth pangs and then you have the false prophets and then you have the testing. So you have a crossover from the birth pangs into the first 3.5 years there. And the 3.5 year point is at the abomination where Jesus lays it out and references Daniel. And then you have the last 3.5 years and the events that he orates at that point in time. So I'm hoping that you enjoyed this. If you wanted part 2 to this series, get a hold of me. You'll also get part 1 with it. And then we're going to finish off these 4 winds of the apocalypse in part 3 in the next show. So until the next time, may God be with you, and may God bless. Thank you.